Patterns of inheritance. Okay, we did most of this in lab, where hopefully you asked your questions. This chapter is primarily on Mendelian genetics. Genetics tells a lot about what the physical limitations and potentials are for an organism. Mendelian genetics specifically calculates probabilities. What are the odds of you getting this from this cross? Okay. DNA is wound tightly into chromosomes, and cells with one set of chromosomes, such as sex cells, are haploid, while two haploid cells fuse and form a diploid zygote. Diploid means a full complement. Most cells of a mature individual are diploid. In fact, the only cells that are haploid are either the sperm or the eggs. Now, diploid cells have two alleles for each gene. Okay, remember, a gene is located on a chromosome, and it can have 2, 3, 4, 5, an infinite number of possible repercussions. We covered very simple ones that just had 2 or 3 possibles. In the blood types, we covered multiple alleles, 3 possibles. And in most of the other ones, we did autosomal recessives, and those just had a dominant and a recessive gene. But they can get quite a bit more complex. Here's the guy that figured it out, Gregor Mendel. He was growing peas to eat and noticed some different traits in the peas. And he was primarily a mathematician, so he started breeding the peas and doing controlled breeding experiments. And by counting the offspring, he came up with ratios, and he was the first person to start discussing probability in offspring. Now, at this time, nobody knew what DNA was. It was completely unknown, and he developed all these rules and figured out if you looked at the physical traits of an organism, by calculating them, he could figure out if they were dominant or recessive. And he would hand pollinate the plants so that he could control breeding. And so he would use little paintbrushes to do that, and move pollen from one plant to the stigma of another plant, so he could cross-pollinate plants and see what the offspring would look like. And he looked at several different types of mutations. True breeding plants produced offspring that were identical to themselves. Okay, and so then he would do cross-fertilization and see what he came up with. And he was using these pea plants. Dominant alleles exert their effects whenever they're present. And so if you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, the dominant physical trait or phenotype will be expressed in the offspring. Recessive allele is one that will only be expressed in the phenotype of the offspring if it is homozygous, meaning 2 recessive alleles. If yellow seed color is dominant, why are some seeds green? When a yellow seed plant's crossed with a green seed plant, we need more information before we can fully answer that question. Okay, and so the answer has to do with each plant having 2 alleles for each gene because of their homologous pairs of chromosomes. So this yellow is a homozygous dominant, 2 capital letters. It can have 1 recessive allele and still be yellow because the dominant yellow allele will mask the green. So in order to get green peas, you have to have a homozygous recessive, meaning 2 recessive alleles. Genotype is the individual's alleles for a trait, and the genotype confers a phenotype. That's the physical characteristics that you can observe. And here are the 3 terms: homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Okay. It's possible to look at offspring to determine the genotype of the parent as well. See Punnett squares can help solve the puzzles. And this is what a Punnett square is. And so you take from each parent, you take their genotype and split it up for one trait, and then you cross them. So here's the female, here's the male. This is heterozygous, this is heterozygous. So he has the female can give either a capital W, a dominant yellow gene or allele, or a lowercase recessive allele, which would be an allele for green. Same with the male. And you just take like this one and put it in that square. This one and put it in that square. This guy and this guy in this square. This guy and this guy in this square. And so when you cross 2 heterozygotes, you'll get a 1 to 3 ratio. So that means there's only 1 out of a 4 chance that you will get a green pea. Okay. This is called a monohybrid cross because we're only crossing one trait. Genotype indicates that all diploid cells, including germ cells in these parents, have both dominant and recessive seed color alleles. And when the germ cells divide by meiosis, the chromosomes and the alleles on those chromosomes are randomly distributed among the gametes. So any offspring can get one of these 4 possible combinations of the parents' alleles. These unite. So each of these little, there's 2 sperm, there's 2 little eggs. That's a gamete, a sex cell. And so this egg gets fertilized by this sperm. Okay. If both gametes carry dominant alleles, the offspring will inherit 2 dominant alleles, and so forth. Now, to learn this stuff, what you're going to need to do is use some of those practice problems. Some of you had some problem with that in lab, but none of you asked questions or asked me to explain it or came and got with me later. And unfortunately, that resulted in not as good of a score as maybe that individual wanted. All right. So these allow us to look at genotypes and calculate the probabilities. That's all it really does. Okay. It's very hard to do a genetics problem on a video. I don't have the equipment to write, draw, etc. That's why I did it in lab. So you would have time to watch some of these crosses done. Here is a Punnett square summarizing meiosis and fertilization. And they're putting this in several forms in the hopes that one way or the other you'll get it. Here's an example of a genetic disorder called cystic fibrosis. It is a recessive allele. So if the 2 parents are both carriers, meaning that they are heterozygous, they have a normal, healthy, non-carrier allele and then a carrier allele, there's a 1 in 4 chance that their offspring will have cystic fibrosis. Now, if you want to do a dihybrid cross, you can do it like that, but I didn't teach that in lab because if you have 2 things you want to look at, okay, then all you want to do is split each trait out into a regular 4-square Punnett square and then do the math. Okay. The P generation is the parental generation, while the F1 is the first. So here's the P generation, the parents, and they've got, this is in a dihybrid cross, they've got two alleles that they're working with. Okay. But this is the best way to do it. There we've got, this is a trihybrid cross. If you split them all out, it's called the product rule. It'll give you a percentage, basically a fraction. So you need to brush up on how to do your fractions. The probability of a crossover event for an allele is the farther away from where it's connected, the closer to the ends of the chromosomes, the higher the probability that you will have a mutation of that sort. Gene expression can appear to alter Mendelian ratios. This one, codominance or incomplete dominance, can cause a blending. So in this case, there's two versions of the recessive allele. There's R1 and R2. Okay. R1 produces a red flower. So if you get two alleles that are R1, your homozygous R1, you'll have a red flower. If you get two alleles that are R2, you would have a white flower. And if you're heterozygous for these traits, you would have a pink flower, because when you mix white and red, you will get pink. You'll see this also applies to blood types. That's how we get AB blood. A blood type is dominant, so is B. And here we go. In codominance, more than one allele encodes a functional protein. So if you have the ABO blood types, okay, AB is generated by having a heterozygous dominant condition. Okay, and so the A can't mask the B and the B can't mask the A. And if you cross them, you will get an AB. Now, there are two alleles, or two ways you can get type A blood and two ways you can get type B blood. You can get two dominant alleles or a dominant and a recessive allele for O. Same for B. If you get an AB blood type, that's because you got two dominant alleles, the A allele and the B allele, and neither one can mask the other. Sex-linked genes have unique inheritance patterns because they're on the X chromosome. Since the Y chromosome is so much smaller, okay, if you have an allele down here that only doesn't have a matching homologous allele because the Y chromosome is so much shorter, recessive alleles can be expressed because they simply don't have a dominant allele from the Y chromosome. And here is the example. So let's see. X-linked recessive disorders affect more males than females because the Y doesn't have a place to have a recessive allele. This is for hemophilia. So here's a normal, healthy daughter, right? And here's the mom, and she's carrying this recessive hemophilia allele. And if she gives this egg to a son, she'll have a hemophiliac son because there is no place on the Y chromosome to have a dominant H. It's just too short. So if you get, as a male, if you get a recessive trait on the X chromosome, it has to come from the mom. You can't get it from the dad because the dad doesn't give his sons an X chromosome. Okay? The dad has to, in order for it to be a son, you can only get the Y chromosome from your dad. So it has to come from your mom. Here are some examples, just for an FYI. Environment. This is a Siamese cat, and there's a lot of Siamese type coloration. What causes this is temperature in the pointed areas, the tail, the feet, the ears, the nose. There is a lower level of vascularization. There aren't as many blood vessels. And since there aren't as many blood vessels, those spots aren't as warm. And since they're not warm, they are black. And they've done tests. They've taken and strapped cold packs to cats. And they change them every hour. And over time, the white hair will shed and it will be replaced by black hair. So it's temperature. Temperature affects that pigment. In warmer temperatures, the black pigments don't express themselves. This is just one example of how environment can alter phenotype. Skin color is a polygenic trait. There are 6 alleles that produce melanin. And so if you're really, really pale and fair-skinned, you won't have any. And if you have very dark skin, you will have all 6 of them. Now, melanin production is dominant to non-melanin production. So if you have 0 of the genes, you are extremely pale, and those are all recessive traits. Now, this is an interesting thing. What they did here, this is a bollworm, and it destroys cotton. And some bollworms will die from this Bt toxin. It's a type of basically insecticide. So they've put the insecticide, they basically genetically engineered the cotton to have inbuilt into it this toxin. All right? And so they did that, and at first it really cut down on this bollworm infestation. Okay? But over time, all the bollworms that were susceptible to the toxin died off, and the only ones that reproduced were the ones that could just ignore it. And so long term, it became a problem because it no longer deterred, because the only bollworms left around that were alive were the ones that were immune to the toxin. Now, the ones that were immune to the toxin, however, were less successful in reproducing in the presence of the ones that were susceptible. So if the Bt toxin killed you, you would be more successful and produce more offspring and outcompete your buddies that were immune from it. Now, this would be under normal circumstances without the cotton that was infested or that was genetically engineered with the gene to produce the toxin. And so now what they do is when they plant a field, they plant part of it with the Bt toxin, and then they plant this part out here with normal cotton that doesn't have the gene for Bt toxin. So the bollworms that die if they eat this produce massive numbers and outcompete the ones that are immune to this. So it dropped the numbers of the ones that were immune to this and increased these numbers. And so they just had to write off a portion of their crop field every year to get a more steady, predictable rate of loss to pests. And that's often the way it is in nature. There's never a perfect solution to anything. And And people do try to oversimplify, but it never quite works out that way. Here are some terms. You're going to want to make sure you know what all these mean. And that is all for Chapter 10.